those of you that don't know what First Family is, or this is one of your first times with us here at First Baptist, we believe that the family is so important that strong churches are made up of strong families. We also believe families are under such an attack that we need more than just a sermon series once or twice a year. We've committed, in addition to our normal topics dealing with the family, we've committed to once a month pushing aside whatever series we're in and focusing like a laser beam on family issues. So this is just one of those. Now this is a little different. We have dealt with remarriage. We have dealt with being single. We've dealt with grandparenting. There are not a whole lot of topics that we haven't touched on. We've got a great slate of First Family Sundays coming up for the fall. Many of those are topics that we have not ever addressed in that format. Some of them are going to be even the roundtable discussions as we've had in the past that were very, very popular, very beneficial to a lot of marriages. But so this morning is something just a little different. It's talking about family groups. And I just want to pause for a minute because I know that some of us are going to want to check out maybe a little bit mentally when we hear that we're talking about small group Bible studies, small group discipleship. And I know that you might think, wait a second, how does this fall under family, other than the fact that you made the name family groups? I didn't do that just for this, because I want you to think about something. Small groups are so important in the life of the believer, and we're going to see why and how small groups are important in the life of the believer in this message this morning. But let me just kind of put it like this. When we come together on Sunday mornings, this is like a spiritual family reunion. You probably have had or been a part of family reunions where you get to see Great Uncle Joe, and you haven't seen Great Uncle Joe for a long time, and you get to single him out and talk to him, but you can't talk most of the time to everybody. You can't give everybody the time that you would want to, nor maybe you might not want to give everybody the time at your family reunion. But this is kind of like that. This is once a week. We come together as a large spiritual family, a large group, and we come together to worship together corporately. But if you think about it, a small group is not this large family get-together. This is not this large spiritual family reunion. A small group is really like a family. It's the difference between your supper table and what takes place here. You see, what takes place here, I can't possibly get involved and have a real meaningful conversation with all of you because of time. And then we got another service behind this one. But in a small group setting, I can get involved in meaningful conversation. I can learn from you. I can grow with you. I can forge and build bonds of relationship in those. This is not a small group. This large group setting that we're a part of, it does serve a purpose. But I want to show you something beautiful this morning in the book of Acts. Now we know that Acts chapter 2 represents the birth of the church. This is when the church was actually born, we could say. When the Spirit descended and came and filled those believers at Pentecost. That was the moment that the church was born. But the text we're reading this morning shows the church's first steps and first words. And I want you to see, look at this text with me, Acts chapter 2, verse 42. Actually, back up to verse 41. So those who received his word, Peter's word, first sermon, so those who received his word were baptized. And there were added that day about 3,000 souls. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. And awe came upon every soul. And many signs and wonders were being done through the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with gladness and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. Let's stop right there. So the church is born at Pentecost, that group of people that were in the upper room praying, waiting, as Jesus had told them. When they were filled with the Spirit, then Peter goes out and preaches the first sermon. And the first sermon yielded tremendous results. 3,000 people were saved. For those of you that think you shouldn't count in church, numbers and attendance don't matter, let me just tell you, 3,000 souls. They knew that because they counted them. They knew that because they were not afraid to stand up and be numbered. They were not afraid to be able to say, yeah, I'm one whose life was changed by Jesus Christ. Okay, you're one. And they were not afraid to be able to be numbered. And they numbered them, and there were 3,000 of them that were saved at Peter's first sermon after Pentecost. 3,000 believers at that moment. Now, there was not a church, a room big enough for all of them to be able to go to. So what happens to those 3,000 believers? What happens to those new converts, those who are freshly born again and have spiritual eggshell on them? What are they going to do? Look what they did. First thing they did was they were baptized. They were publicly identifying with this band of believers. Remember, this was not popular. This was not a great time to be a Christian. There was still serious persecution as you read through the book of Acts. And those 3,000 that were saved, that were not afraid to stand up and say, yeah, that's me, they followed Jesus in believers' baptism. The first step of obedience in the life of the believer, and they took that first step. Publicly identifying with Christ and Christ's family. And then secondly, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. You remember the Great Commission that Jesus gave the church before he ascended? He told us to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I've commanded you. And he promised us that he would be with us forever. Lo, I'm with you forever, even to the end of the age. Jesus said the Great Commission was to make disciples. Be followers of Christ who make followers of Christ. Be a maturing Christian that replicates himself through the Word of God with the aid of the Spirit of God in the midst of the people of God. What happens to these believers? The moment they're saved and they publicly identify with Christ, baptized, and then they devoted themselves. You know what happens in small groups? These were small groups, by the way. The Bible tells us in this chapter that they were meeting from house to house. They would go into their homes and they would fellowship together with one another. So what was one of the first components of these small groups that these large group broke out into? The first component of that was discipleship. They were on a journey. This was something where these people, number one, discipleship, this was a moment where they were personally devoted to studying, hearing, and learning. This was the Great Commission fleshed out. This was these were the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 to 20. This is where it stopped being ink and started being life. This was the fleshing out of those words. Notice it says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. These were believers who understood the magnitude of what took place in them. They understood that Jesus Christ really is supreme over all things. They realized the significance and the weight of what had happened to them and transpired, and they turned around. Notice, Peter never said, go get in a small group. Peter never said, you better find a Sunday school class. Peter preached the word, they were saved, and what happened? They went and found groups. It was almost supernatural. These people, upon hearing the word and having their lives changed, immediately go out and find other believers. And they start studying with them. They start growing in this knowledge of God. They start hearing and hungering for the words of Jesus and the teachings. They wanted to know more. This was natural for these children of God to want to be around the people of God to learn the things of God. Sometimes we have a lackadaisical approach to spiritual growth. We assume that it'll just happen over time. If I go to church long enough, it'll just happen. Certainly, I would like to think that there's something that sticks. But truth be told, spiritual maturity does not happen on accident. It doesn't happen apart from a devotedness, commitment, a decision, an act of the will. To say, God, I want to grow and learn more about you. We're not prone to naturally want to know more about God. We're prone to naturally move away from God. I want you to see the second thing that takes place in the second part of verse 42. After they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, they're growing. After we move from discipleship, we see the second thing, and it says fellowship. All the ships. The fellowship is outlined by breaking bread and prayers. These people ate together and prayed together. There was a mingling of both the physical and the spiritual taking place in these groups. These were people that enjoyed being around each other. These were people that shared prayer requests and needs. These were people that would bow a knee and bend a head together. And I'll tell you, there is a particular bond that takes place when God's people pray together. When you spend time face down with a brother or sister praying for a particular need, you have entered into that prayer with them. Oh man, there is a particular bond. With them praying together, no doubt there was accountability that took place. I like what somebody said, speaking of groups. None of us are as strong or smart as all of us. And these early believers, just being born again into a hostile environment that only got more hostile, they realized the significance of coming together. Not just growing in a knowledge of God and discipleship, but in growing in a relationship with others through fellowship, eating together, breaking bread, praying together, accountability, with depth of relationship, with strength and insight for the journey. These people found joy in being together. I want you to see this third one. The third component of this group. It's in verse 43. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. I love this. All those people that were in groups, Luke records in this book of Acts that they were all in awe. Fear, reverence, jaw-dropping, wonder. And I titled this one, instead of just discipleship and fellowship, I looked at verse 43 and I thought, what does verse 43 tell me about the significance of this group and the significance, I believe, of groups? What have I experienced in the groups that I've been a part of? And it's this. Number 3 is fascination. When you come together in a small group with other believers, you know what happens? You get invited to a front row seat of what God is doing in the life of others. You get to hear about the struggles and the trials. You get to hear about the hardships. You get to see the tears and feel the tremble of those who are burdened under a load of care. And you get to partner with them in prayer. But even more than all of that, you get to rejoice. You get to celebrate. You get to lift up. You get to raise your hands in praise and worship. You get to stand slack-jawed at what God has done in the life of others because you've spent time with them. You've heard the needs. You've sensed the weight. You have carried the burden. You have partnered in prayer. You have longed with them for God's remedy to their situation, and you see it in here. Let's be honest. We have great praise and worship time. We're blessed with the musicians. And I enjoy seeing all of your faces, and we've got great greeters. But let me ask you this. When was the last time you were fascinated by something God did in here? You don't know all of the stories. This side doesn't know what this side's going through. This side is not aware of the struggles of this side or the victories of this side. There's a certain level of detachment that we have because of size, and groups allow for that intimacy, to be fascinated, to be slack-jawed over what God is doing. They were all fearfully amazed by God in that group. They saw, heard, and experienced God in tangible ways. Whether it was the healings, the restorations, whatever it was, they were in awe. Number 4 takes place in verse 44 and 45. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. They were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as they had need. I know in the past there have been some that said, well, this is communism, socialism. Let me just say this right now, and I hate that I even have to say this. This is not communism, nor is this socialism, for 2 reasons. One is, it was not distributed equally. It was distributed as there was a need. Secondly, they were not forced to do it. They chose to do it. It was the group. Now, what does this mean for us? Number 4, ministry. In the New Testament, there are 59 times one another is mentioned. 59 times. Now, some of those are replicas. There's love one another, right? Where do not judge one another. There are some that are repeated throughout the New Testament, but ultimately there are 59, not unique, but 59 times one another is mentioned. You know how difficult it is for us to accomplish those one another's in here? In your bulletin, I put a one another verse every week, a different verse every week of a one another, one way that we can bless somebody else's life. But do you know how difficult it is to do a one another in here? It's almost impossible to do it well in here. Small groups give us the opportunity to be able to do the one another's, to live and impact individual lives. Literally, small groups let each one of us move from the passenger to a place of piloting in ministry. You see here, it's kind of a deal where there are really just a small percentage of people that play a part in Sunday morning compared to the people that are in here. All of us that are here, there's a relatively small percentage that make Sundays happen. Now, don't get me wrong, that's a larger number than most, and I'm thankful for each person that plays a part. But when you get in a small group and you start knowing and learning about the needs and the lives of people, you know what it allows you to do in that small group setting? It allows you to meet those needs. It allows you to minister to them. You stop becoming a spectator and start becoming a participant in the area of ministry. Small groups allow ministry in ways that large groups don't. Number 5, worship. Found in verse 43 and 47, and all came upon every soul. Verse 47, praising God. I believe what Luke is referencing here is both praise and worship. There is a distinction, though subtle, there's a distinction between the two. Worship is our response to who God is. Praise is our response to what He's done. And here in the midst of these groups, they have seen a portion of who God is. They have seen God do things amidst those little groups and large groups. And praise and worship comes from their lips twice in this short description of the early church. We see people with hands raised. We see people with mouths open, worshiping. Yes, if Acts chapter 2 records the birth of the early church, her first steps, or in small groups. Number 6, the final one. The sixth and final thing that I believe this shows us that happens in small groups is evangelism. Look at verse 47. Praising God, having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. The Lord didn't just add to their number on Sundays. The Lord saved people on Mondays. Can you believe that? Can any good thing come on a Monday? Tuesdays, people were saved. Wednesdays, why? Because these people were living out their faith on Mondays, on Tuesdays. To me, number 6 is the most logical conclusion. Please hear what I'm saying. We shouldn't be surprised about number 6. Evangelism in this sense shouldn't surprise us at all. You know why? There were people who were devoted to their walk with Christ, disciples. There were people who were fellowshipping with other believers, praying together. There were people who were fascinated at what God was doing. There were people meeting needs to the extent that they were selling their own possessions to meet their needs. There were people who were awestruck at what God was doing. There were people who were literally, whose lives were changed. All of the first 5, discipleship, fellowship, fascination, ministry, worship, all of these things were happening through this body of believers. And I'll tell you, if discipleship, fellowship, fascination, ministry, and worship is happening, the logical conclusion is people are going to get saved. Why? Because they have just found people whose hair has been lit on fire by Christ. They have found people who are not just a one-day-a-week Christian. They are people whose lives have been changed. They're hungry for the Word. They love God. They love other people. They're looking for opportunities to minister. They're being awestruck by who He is. And let me tell you something. When we possess those first 5, it shouldn't surprise us that number 6 comes along too. When those first 5 are there. Guys, this is not this morning me just teaching what we find about this group in the book of Acts. This is to remind the leaders of groups that we have now, the groups that meet on campus. This is a reminder. This is what our groups are to have. This is to be the DNA of the groups that we lead. This is to encourage us to say, I'm hungry for that. I need that. I want that. And I know what you're going to say. Let me tell you something. I believe small groups are the key to church life. To come to a church without being a part of a small group is like going to the Cheesecake Factory and not ordering a cheesecake. It's like going to an amusement park and not riding the rides and complaining that their funnel cakes don't taste good. It's like buying a convertible and not ever dropping the top. The best part of the experience is groups, our groups. And I know what you're going to say. Let me tackle really quick 3 things. First is this. I know there's some. It happens all the time. When someone comes into my office or I'm having lunch with someone, I talk with them about groups. There's this one. It's just not for me. Group's not for me. Think about that comment for a minute. Some of you may have been thinking that. That's nice. I want people to be a part of it, but it's not for me. Do we realize that comment, it's not for me, I believe, represents some of the worst of Western consumeristic attitude as it relates to church? To view what I just said about small groups through the lens of what will you get out of it goes against the very reason those people were a part of those groups. We look at church, we look at service opportunities, we look at other disciplines in the Christian life and are tempted to run it through this filter. Do I like it? Do I want to do it? As a slave of Christ, when did it matter? Really, what we wanted, what we liked. This isn't Walmart. This is the body of Christ. You come into a church now, and I know we're just as guilty as the next person. You come into a church now, we'll tell you what we offer. If you're a first-time guest here, I'm going to tell you we got a great children's program. And we do. I want to tell you we got a great student program, and we do. We've got an amazing body of deacons, and we do. There's great worship. There's mediocre teaching at best. And it is. We want to give you this list and menu of things that we offer for you. You come in here, we give you a menu. You walked in the early church, you know what they gave you? A wash rag. And told you to start cleaning up the widow's table. That's exactly what they would do. We focus on what we get out of it. That attitude, well, it's just not for me. You know what? Biblically, it is for you. I'm going to go ahead and say that. It is for you. And it's not just about what you get out of it. Maybe you think it's not for you, but you are for somebody else. You are for somebody else. Somebody else can benefit from your life. Second reason we often don't be a part of groups is we say we don't have time. The truth be told, we know this. We make time for what is important to us. We make time for what we value. Let me ask you this. I mentioned to you 6 components of small groups. And I have seen these happen. This is not me talking in theory. This is me speaking from experience. I have seen these 6 things happen in the DNA of groups. And let me ask you this. If just 2 of these happened, if just 2, discipleship, fellowship, fascination, ministry, evangelism, worship, if just 2 of those hit your life, wouldn't it be worth it? Yes. If just 1 of those hit your life, wouldn't it be worth it? Yes. It's not that we don't have time. We make time for the things that are important. And the last one is this. You're reluctant to be a part of a small group because there are things in your life you don't want other people to know. You're afraid you'll get found out. Let me tell you this. If you're worried right now about being a part of a group because someone's going to find you out, first of all, that goes against the DNA of a body of a group of believers. In these groups, we are vulnerable. In these groups, we find friends that we trust and that we love. In these groups, we can hold hands together and say we're all in over our heads. And if that's you that says, I wouldn't be a part of a group because they'll find me out or find it out, that tells me you don't have a group's problem, you've got a God problem. Because if you can't fellowship in authentic relationships with God's people, it leads me to believe that your fellowshipping with God is not right either. If you've got a fellowship problem down here, an authentic fellowship problem down here with man, it would cause me to wonder if you have a fellowship problem with God. Not that you're not saved, that's not what I'm saying. But are you out of step with God? Groups are not for perfect people. If they were, there would be none. This early church turned the world on its head. Turned the world upside down. We owe a tremendous debt to that group of people right there in the Lord. Let me ask you a question. Did they have more of the Spirit than we did? No. No. I believe what we have is not just a recounting of history. I believe what we have in here is a recipe for turning our community and the world upside down. We're getting ready to offer family groups in just this fall. You're going to have opportunity to sign up. And you're going to be tempted not to do it. I'm going to ask you to consider signing up for those groups. Maybe today you've come in here and you've never been a part of one of our groups that meet here at the 9 and 10:30 hour. And today you have an opportunity to walk out that door and go about your day. Or you this morning could, instead of turning right, you could turn left. And you could go up into one of those classes and you could sit and you could take me and God's word at its word. I hope this morning you'll turn left. Hey, thanks so much for listening to our podcast at First Baptist Joplin. If you are interested in coming and worshiping with us live, we would love for you to come at 9 and 10:30 on Sunday mornings.